Is it 2 sheets?
2
Oh,
sheets.
there's 2 sheets.
Yeah, one's devoted to human service organizations, and the other one's devoted to bureaucracy and complex organizations.
Thank you.
So you're handing me back the same thing I'm
You gave it to her. You just having a good time making it.
I've been at this long enough to know that anytime you pass up more than one, there's going to be problems. I don't care.
It's been a very long day.
This is what happens when you have a class that starts at 7.
There you go. There you go. Well, there'll be a special surprise for you later on.
Oh,
I
can't
promise.
wait.
Promise. Promise. Okay. Here's the game plan for today. Want to talk with you a bit about some very, very basic orienting concepts. In this case, it's going to be the nature, organization, synonyms generally. Complex organization, formal organization, or organizations. We're going to use those terms, all mean the same thing for us in this class. They're generally used interchangeably. You can always find people who make some distinctions, but in general, complex organizations, formal organizations, or organizations will mean the same thing to us. We're also going to talk about the bureaucracy as a concept. It's a very special kind of concept called an ideal type. How many of you are sociology majors? Anybody? Really? Well, that's kind of surprised. Have you heard the name, you might have pronounced it Max Weber, you know, the German sociologist. He's the one who created this notion of an ideal type that is a construct, a carefully defined concept that it's not even necessarily implied that it actually exists, or that one can actually find an example that captures in an ideal way in the real world all of those particular characteristics, but rather it's a defining example. It's as an ideal type, it's understanding the ideal type so that you can understand how various dimensions of the ideal type could be applied to understanding the real world. So Weber he crafts an ideal type of bureaucracy which has been compelling in the Western world for understanding formal organizations. Notice that Weber didn't necessarily believe that organizations actually functioned exactly that way, but he was distilling certain what he regarded as defining elements or defining characteristics of organizations that were bureaucracies, and then really driving home what those particular defining characteristics are or were. So we'll take a look at that, because I think one of the things you're going to see is that just as the landscape of Western organizations has been dominated by bureaucracies, that's also true of human service organizations. Most human service organizations are actually the employers of social workers, which means that most social workers work in human service organizations, and most human service organizations have very strong approximations to bureaucracy. So the more we kind of understand what those defining characteristics are, the less surprised we are perhaps when we bump our shin against a certain element of bureaucracy, or the better we can guide ourselves or clients through that kind of structure. And then we'll talk much more specifically about human service organizations themselves, a particular kind or family of organizations. Having done that, we will then briefly examine these major theoretical traditions that your authors have written about in this particular chapter, chapter 3. And I'm going to break you down into some groups. I want you to take a look at the case example that was included in the reading for today. And then each group, I would like you to nominate a particular spokesperson who would then be able to speak to that case from a particular perspective. And that'll be the class for today. All right, so that's where we're going. So let's start, and we'll obviously throw a break in there, but not quite yet. Let's start with understanding what an organization is. And definitions aren't right or wrong. They're more or less useful And I particularly find this definition of organization from the sociologist Richard Hall to be the best single definition of a complex organization I've encountered. It's a long one, it's encompassing, but I think it does the job quite well. And just reading it, an organization is a collectivity with a relatively identifiable boundary, a normative order, ranks of authority, communication systems, and membership coordinating systems. This collectivity exists on a relatively continuous basis in an environment and engages in activities that are usually related to a set of goals. Right? Now, let's dissect this particular definition, remembering that we're going to come back to practically every one of these elements in the definition later on in the semester. Because, frankly, this definition is just pregnant with all kinds of nuances and all kinds of complexities that might not appear to you at this point in time, but you'll certainly appreciate it later on in the semester. Right? So, an organization is a collectivity. What's he mean by collectivity? What's that? Collection of? Yeah, all that stuff, but it's as basic as it could be.
People.
People. Yeah, the collection of people. It's a collection of departments, right? Collection of activities. There are a variety of nouns that one could use, but the important thing here is, and remember, Hall is a sociologist, so he's looking at collective behavior anyway. So an organization is composed of multiple persons, and frankly, in an organization, it's going to be doing multiple things in multiple roles, but has a relatively identifiable boundary. Now, first of all, I would hope that you're thinking, whoa, boundary, I've heard that recently. You know, systems theory, sure. Systems theory permeates this particular definition. What might be some examples? And again, I'm going to give you a clue here. There's no one right answer here. There really isn't. What are some examples of an organizational boundary? Services that it does or doesn't provide. That's a very good example of that. Right? What's another example of an organizational boundary? Hiring requirements, right. Who is and who isn't a member of the organization. That's exactly right. Service area. Very, very good. Yeah, where is the organization present? And how can you begin to get a sense of where the boundary is in terms of where it does its thing and where it doesn't do its thing? By the way, later on we'll talk about a concept called organizational domain. Organizational domain. And that's a combination of what an organization does, who it does it to or for, and where those interventions or services are provided. That combination of three elements constitutes an organization's domain. And when you know or you can map an organizational domain, you have a pretty good idea of whether the organization is in a competitive environment or not. So let's say that Marcia's organization provides educational services in Johnson City specifically to the elderly. Okay, JJ's organization provides educational services in Johnson City only, but to children no older than age 18. Are the two agencies in competition with one another? Likely not, because their domain differs in a significant way on one, but only one respect, but that's all that's necessary in many cases. On the other hand, if JJ's organization offers educational services without regard to age, whereas Marcia's offers educational services to people over the age of 65, there's an element of competition that exists as potential between these organizations. We might begin to look for the ways that that competition is managed, right? In a variety of ways that organizations do that. Okay. Boundary can be a tricky question or a tricky issue, though. And let me take you to a military community, or we could take you to the top of a corporate ladder. Right? Many of you know that I was in the service, and it was interesting to me to watch what we referred to as Mrs. Colonels on the base. And these were the wives of high-ranking officers on a military base. They were not They were not active duty military members themselves. They were dependents in a military family. And yet, you had to be very, very careful in terms of how you interacted with the Mrs. Colonels. Even if you were a commissioned officer yourself. But if you were an officer's wife on that base, and you were a lieutenant's wife or a captain's wife or a major's wife, and you came into contact with Mrs. Colonel, right, it would be very, very important for you to observe all the due diligence in your relationship with this individual, because it was almost like Mrs. Colonel was wearing a shadow set of eagles on her shoulders as well. Right? Was Mrs. Colonel a part of the military? Well, in some ways, yes. Even as a dependent, right? Carried an ID. So wasn't an active duty service member, but did carry an ID. Was permitted onto the base, could go into the BX or the PX or the commissary or the theater or whatever. You know, was covered by the medical and dental insurance and the life insurance, etc. Same way with the kids. But who had the more significant performance obligations? Well, it was the person who had taken the oath. So one of the ways to know who is and who isn't a member of an organization is to look at performance obligations, right? Regardless of perhaps the quicker and sometimes less nuanced notion of where that boundary happens to exist, who is and who is not a member of the system. So my question for you is this. Think of your agency where you're doing your placement, or think of your agency where you're employed. Right? Think of the employees there. Are the employees part of the agency? Is the boundary wrapped around them? Would you say yes or would you say no?
Yes.
You would say yes, wouldn't you? Right? Right. As an intern in such an agency, are you part of the agency?
Yes.
In a number of ways you are, aren't you? What are some of those ways?
Apply the same regulations.
They're right. You have performance obligations, don't you? Yeah. So your practice, your presence there is still governed by the same regulations or the same policies that are levied upon employees. Right. In some ways, are you apart from the organization as well?
Yes.
Yeah, you are, aren't you? As a student intern, you probably have a bit more freedom to access individuals, perhaps, when you have to be there, the kind of things you're expected to do, the workload you're expected to have, etc. Okay. How about the clients? How about the clients of your agencies? Are they members of the organization? Some of you are shaking your head no, but here's the reply. Do they have performance obligations levied upon them? They do, don't they? And if they fail to comply, they may no longer be clients of the organization, right? So we typically, very, very typically, we wouldn't think of clients as members of the organization until we begin to look at them from a different kind of membership prism, right? And remember the concept that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, lower participant, people who are at the very bottom of the power gradient within organizations. Right? So maybe a lot of clients and a lot of social service agencies might be thought of as members of an organization for various kind of tasks or challenges we have ahead of us. And maybe we need to appreciate the level of power they have as they exercise their membership in the organization. Anyway, that's just by way of saying, hey, when we get to this point in the definition where they're talking about identifiable boundary, whoa, maybe it's not all that identifiable after all. Maybe there are a variety of different kind of boundaries that we might be able to identify based upon the issue at hand, the organization at hand, and our own level of preparation to look through various kinds of lenses. Normative order. Here's another element of this definition. What do you think Hall is alluding to when he's talking about normative order?
The way things should work, there's the written way and then there is the actual, but the normative would be the way things should be facilitated.
Yeah, there are actually different nuances. There are different kind of shades of how norms are defined. Certainly one is the should statements. This is what you should do. But you know something, in organizations, there's all kinds of people telling you what you should do. You know, there's the people who write the manuals and the policy statements. Then there's your supervisor. Chances are your supervisor is telling you to do some things a bit differently than the way that they're written. Then there are your peers, particularly the peers that have been around for a long time, who are telling you, no, we don't do that. You know, if you do that, you'll never get anywhere. Come here, let me show you how it's done. Those kind of things, right? And then in different kind of networks or different kind of informal groups throughout the organization, there are many times very, very different, sometimes even competing sets of norms and expectations that people have with regard to organizational membership. So is there one normative order within an organization? Probably not. Probably many normative orders, frankly, within an organization. And it'd be interesting to see how they align with one another, how consistent they are with one another as one moves through various and particularly important segments of the organization. Ranks of authority, another important and defining concept here. One of the interesting things about organizations is that it's the first place, if you will, where we encounter intentional differential distribution of power. I'm going to say it differently. As we go from individuals to groups up to organizations, when we get to organizations, power is intendedly distributed unevenly across membership.
Justified inequality.
It is justified inequality and power. That's exactly what it's going to be. And we're going to be seeing very soon that that inequality and power is also justified and justifies an inequality in remuneration or reward to individuals who are members of the organization. Ranks of authority speak also to hierarchy in an organization. And when we get to Weber's concept of bureaucracy, you'll see how this really plays out as well. There are communication systems in organizations. Matter of fact, communication science is one of the major disciplines that studies organizations. Made very important contributions to our understanding of organizations. And again, variety of communication systems. And as our examination into the D2L system just a few minutes ago showed, some of those don't always work the way they're intended. Are you in a placement? Or are you? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you think of something that's pretty important that's happened in the organization within the last month or so? Anything that strikes you as particularly important?
Not important.
Something that would be significant, something that people want to know and think it affects their lives or their ability to do their work well?
Productivity numbers.
Okay, productivity numbers.
Talked about.
We've talked about it, all right. How was the communication about productivity numbers communicated to people in the organization? Staff meeting. So it was just oral communication? Was there any written communication that was involved?
The therapists were supposed to bring their numbers to the meeting.
Okay, so the therapists were supposed to prepare those numbers, bring them to the meeting where they would then be discussed, all right? Did everybody get the word about that? No, okay. So some people who should have been participating in that didn't get the word, okay? All right. By the way, what impact, if any, did that make upon the quality of the discussion and any quality of decision making that arose?
Frustrated the supervisor and the two people who didn't remember to bring the numbers at the beginning of it, and it just kind of halted everything for a while.
Okay, so frustrated supervisor, embarrassed, somewhat frustrated or disgruntled people who were supposed to be doing the work but didn't get the word. Probably feel some resentment about that. At least that would be a typical human reaction to that kind of thing. Chilling the environment of the discussion for a period of time, slowing the process down. Okay. Did anybody get knowledge of that communication who wasn't intended to get it? You weren't intended to get it?
I'm not responsible for productivity numbers yet. I mean, it's not an employee, so.
Okay, all right. But you were aware of it? Okay.
Well,
all right.
I didn't know they were supposed to bring anything to the meeting because I'm not. And I don't think it was expressly communicated. I think it's just you're supposed to bring your numbers every time.
Oh, so maybe it wasn't as formal, as assertive as it could have been.
No, I don't think it was.
Okay. And that might have been a factor in the fact that some of the individuals weren't aware that that was required of them. Okay. Okay. Look what happened here. A relatively simple kind of task for, let's say, a supervisor to say to his or her immediate subordinates, bring your numbers so we can discuss productivity at the next meeting, which will be at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the time we usually meet. And yet, not everybody gets the word, or not everybody understands what it means for them, what their tasks are to this kind of process. It delays and kind of colors in probably an uncomfortable way the discourse that goes on there. Who knows what it does in terms of interpersonal relationships, at least for a period of time. And that's just one little simple communication between a supervisor and how many subordinates or how many supervisees? 8 or 10 that day. Okay. All right. How many people does General Motors employ? How many people are employed in the Tennessee Department of Children's Services? You know, all of a sudden you're talking about mega institutions, really. And how many people are trying to communicate with others there? How many people are trying to be involved in the shoulds or even the requests or the communication of important information? There's an old adage in the Army that basically goes this way: there's always somebody who doesn't get the word. And one of the things that communication science shares with us, and you've probably seen this too with examples, maybe you've done it as a team building kind of thing. This is almost a great way of doing it. Were I to whisper over here some kind of comment and ask you to whisper to you, you to whisper to you, you to whisper to you, if it's anything longer than just a couple of sentences, the message that starts out here is not going to be the message that you receive over there. If it's a single word, it's probably going to get through. Blue, 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 blue. You know, that's probably not going to morph to green at some point in time, right? But if I tell a brief little story of 5 or 6 sentences, right, who knows what it's going to wind up over here? Chances are you're going to get a 3-sentence summary or you're going to get a 5-page treatise, but it won't be the same kind of thing, right? So can you imagine when communication is going either up or down? Let's say it's particularly it's going down. And people are trying to interpret the boss's policy, the boss's position. Of course, the boss has changed each time. It starts out as the one boss, and then it becomes 10 bosses, the boss and 9 subordinate bosses. And then as it goes down from layers and layers and layers, the number of bosses becomes, in some respects, geometrically magnified. Right? People providing their own interpretations on that kind of thing. You get a sense that communication, accurate, timely, purposeful communication in organizations can be a huge challenge. We all know that. Communication systems, okay? And membership coordinating systems. Membership coordinating systems. Membership coordinating systems can be formal and informal in organizations. Your boss and the train of bosses represent one kind of membership coordinating system. Very formal. Manuals, policies, procedures represent, in a written form, but a very powerful form, systems for regularizing behavior, for coordinating behavior, for reducing uncertainty, unpredictability, and randomness within an organization. By the way, so much of formal organization is devoted to expelling randomness. We have a systems principle there, don't we? What's a systems principle? Systems seek to export entropy. Remember that? Systems seek to export entropy. Randomness in an organization is entropy, right? If I give you 5 different materials and ask you to make a widget, right? And you know how to make a widget, Maybe you have one done in 5 minutes. Right? Very purposeful, very intended set of actions on those components, key components. I give the same components to you and you start juggling with them. Okay? And then you start bouncing them back and forth to Vanessa. Right? Well, I didn't expect that. That really wasn't part of our intended technology and how you deal with it. Now, eventually you might get around to making a widget, maybe even in a creative way, but chances are you just made it in 5 minutes and you just made it in 15. We've got, 5, 15, we've got 10 minutes of randomness in there. Organization's going to try and drive that out.
How do you say the manual is a membership coordinating system?
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, because it's not the membership coordinating system is any set of, let's say, variables that in fact begin to regulate, begin to make more predictable the behavior of individuals who have a performance obligation as a member of the organization. So when you're working for DCS, right? And I'll bet you've spent hours and hours and hours and hours reading manuals and policy documents. Oh yeah. And what's the intent behind there? Is it just to make you informed, or is it to shape your behavior? Ultimately, it's to shape your behavior. That's exactly right.
So,
Go ahead.
bosses and policy manuals would be formal.
Mm-hmm.
What would be an example of informal?
Fantastic question. Do you have, again, don't necessarily point them out, but do you have friends among the MSW student body? Okay. Do you ever talk to your friends about, let's say, about the amount of time that you're going to put into a project, or how you're going to actually handle the presentation, let's say, in a class? Okay. Do you find yourself altering your behavior with reference to the expectations or the guidance that you get from your peers? Yeah. So even the informal groups within organizations become powerful motors, if you will, centers for the coordination of individuals, but not in ways that the architects of the organization intended in most cases. Right? This collectivity exists on a relatively continuous basis in an environment and engages in activities, transactions that are necessary between the organization and its environment, most of the time with other organizations or members of other organizations, engages in activities that are usually related to a set of goals. Now, I'm not going to go much beyond the goals right now because we're going to come back to that in a couple of weeks. But just let me say that goals are one of the most complex, one of the most elusive concepts that we're going to deal with all semester. Ranks right up there with effectiveness, in my opinion, as an important concept and one that has so many different shades of meaning. We've already talked a little bit about the different shades of the word goal, right? Remember our distinction between goals of and goals for the organization? Every one of you can have goals for the MSW program. Every one of you can have goals for Department of Social Work. Right? But at this point in time, you're not a member of a constituency or of a coalition that has gained its ascendancy so that you can impose your goals onto the way the organization spends its money, engages its efforts, and actually tries to get things done, what it tries to get done. So you're not yet in a position to make your goals of the organization the goals for the organization. Just a little bit more, just as teasers. There's a difference between official goals and operative goals. Official goals and operative goals. Official goals are those they're one step below the mom, American flag, apple pie kind of statements that organizations make about themselves. All right? Official goals might be to serve this community by providing the highest quality services we can. It's a very laudable statement. That's a very laudable statement. Okay? And it will probably remain unchanged for years, if not decades, because that's one of the characteristics of official goals. They're relatively unchanging. And yet the environment of human service organizations is ever changing. And so what the organization actually needs to do in order to remain viable has to be constantly monitored and adapted. All right? So we keep the official documents out there, the official goal statements out there, but guess what? What arises typically is a whole array of what are called operative goals. And these are the things we're actually trying to achieve. They actually have faces to them. They actually have due dates to them. We're actually monitoring that. Now, they're usually related to our official goals. They're not usually way the opposite or way divorced, but they're much more specific. They're much more time limited. They're much more politically astute in some ways, right? And those things can change powerfully. So, when we come back here and we talk about usually related to a set of goals, here's the question I have for you and for Dr. Hall. Which goals? The official goals or the operative goals? We'll talk more about goals. One of the most prevalent types of organizations, not the only kind, but one of the most prevalent types of organizations in the Western world, especially in the world of work, is the bureaucracy. Now, we're going to use bureaucracy in two different ways here. One is an ideal type. Again, we borrow from Max Weber for this, the inventor of this concept. It's a defining example that doesn't necessarily exist in the real world exactly that way, but rather the characteristics of the ideal type, in this sense, the bureaucracy, give us perspectives to examine, and that helps. It may help us better understand the organization that we're looking at as we begin to view the relative level of authority and the nature of authority, the kind of rules and the level of rules there, the kind and level of social control, etc. And what Weber in the ideal type argues, and again, this is the first half of those 8 characteristics that are included on the handout that I've just given you. Weber's going to argue that in its ideal form, bureaucracy begins to maximize all of these kind of elements. Now, in reality, was aware, as we need to be, that bureaucracies can vary considerably from example to example, from organization to organization. So when I use the word bureaucracy to refer to an existing organization, as I will, as most people will, realize that we're using a concept to kind of define a character of the organization, but a bureaucratic character that itself can be highly variable, so long as it adheres, in essence, to the majority of these kinds of concepts. So what are these concepts? Right? Authority is the first one. And notice that Weber locates authority in bureaucracies primarily in office. He says, authority resides in individuals by virtue of their incumbency in offices and or their expertise. There's a hierarchical organization of offices, some higher, some lower than others. And compliance is to fixed or universal and fixed rules. What Weber is trying to argue here in a bureaucracy is that it is the position, it is the organizational status that is the prime host for the authority of the incumbent. So somebody can be your boss, and at work, that person can tell you to do things, you'd better do it. But when that person retires or when that person is fired, that person is demoted and they're no longer your boss, when they tell you to do the same thing, do you necessarily have to obey it? You don't. In other words, the person can be the same person, but because they're now occupying a different status within the organization, a different office, or they're not occupying the office at all, they no longer have the same power available to them within the organization. Now notice that authority can also originate in the expertise of the individual. So have any of you encountered Weber's thoughts in any other context other than organizations, the study of organizations? Have any of you encountered it in his work on power, especially authority? Because Weber argues that he defines authority as power which is legitimate in the eyes of individuals experiencing that power, particularly subject to it. And then he says there are three primary ways that raw power can be transformed into authority, or power that is seen as legitimate in its exercise. And one is by formal rules, legal rational. And that's really what he's talking about with regard to office here. Another is by expertise. You know, if you're in a traffic accident, God forbid, and you're bleeding badly, and somebody comes up and says, "Hi, I'm a trauma room doctor," right? Okay, fine. You know, you're probably not going to ask for an ID. Just, you know, start bandaging, kind of thing, because you have a belief that the person has expertise, and they may ask you to do all kinds of things. You know, hey, stand on your head. You know, we want your heart below your head, or whatever it is, or above your head. Maybe you're going to do it, right? In other words, you're going to comply with the power that the individual is exercising because of your belief in the knowledge that that person has. And then the third thing is charisma, the power of personality that transforms power into authority. Well, you notice here in bureaucracy, Weber is actually incorporating two of the three elements that make for legitimacy in the exercise of power. One is the notion of embedding certain kinds and types of power within the office that individuals later occupy. And the second is by virtue of the expertise that individuals are expected to have to occupy the office. Right? Well, by the way, throughout this discussion of the major characteristics of bureaucracy and how bureaucracies are structured and how they're supposed to function, there's one overarching principle here that is paramount from Weber's perspective, and that's rationality. Rationality. And virtually everything about a bureaucracy is to be examined from the perspective of rationality, and that's to be the guiding principle in decisions that are made about that. So when he talks about rules, for example, and we're going to come to the... Oh, by the way, in the sociology of organizations, when we're talking about authority, we're frequently talking about the concept of centralization and decentralization, because that's a major organizational theory concept relating to power. Centralization is the extent to which power is concentrated in a system. Decentralization is the extent to which it is distributed or differentially concentrated at certain kind of points in the organization. Right? The typical kind of diagram that you see for a bureaucracy, particularly a hierarchical one, is the pyramid or the triangle, right? And the steeper the sides relative to and the longer the sides relative to the base, that attempts to convey a particular distance from the highest to the lowest members of the organization. And that's defined primarily in terms of power. In contrast, a diagram that would look more like this, broad base, more gently sloping sides, less of a differentiation between the lowest participants and the elite of the organization, that would begin to suggest that power is distributed more widely within the organization. Those would be typical things that you might see in the literature. With regard to rules, the concept to look for, particularly in sociology literature and administrative literature, is formalization. Because formalization speaks to two things. It's the number of rules that exist within the system, and it's also the specificity of those rules. Some organizations have relatively few rules, and the rules that they have might provide wide latitude anyway. Right? You would tend to think of those as kind of entrepreneurial organizations, or you might also think of them as kind of grassroots organizations, many times mom and pop kind of stores, or organizations that way as well. As a matter of fact, I think the bias in social work, at least from the social work line practitioner level, is that that's the way things should be in virtually all human service organizations. There should be a minimum of rules and a maximum of flexibility and latitude permitted of organizational members. Right? But what happens there, by the way, is that many times that's professional speak happening within the organization. And what we might actually be saying when we offer those kind of opinions is, as a professional practitioner, I really don't want organizational members, even bosses of organizations, who aren't professional social workers or at least professionals in the human services, telling me how to practice my profession. Right? Notice there are actually two different kind of things that are going on there. One is how you comport yourself, how you do your things as a member of the organization. The other is how you comport yourself and how you do your things as a member of a profession. Social work is a profession that grew even as agencies are growing, historically. We're an agency-based profession for the most part, and yet organizational theory, administrative theory, and organizational logic tend to point us in certain directions in terms of the should statements, whereas the profession points us in some different directions. So for example, when we're talking about social control, formalization, and hierarchy, from an organizational sense, we might be expected to ask our supervisors or seek guidance from supervisors to stay within fairly carefully controlled limits for behavior as an organizational member. But as a social work practitioner, we're continually encountering situations and people who lie outside the typical kind of expectations. And we don't have the opportunity necessarily to delay action to go back and seek this kind of direction from an organizational superior. And after all, you're being trained in the premier degree level of one of the most important professions in human services. You're being prepared for independent self-critical practice. Why should you go back to an organizational supervisor, particularly one who might not be a social worker, to ask questions about how you should engage in your professional practice? Notice what's happening here? Yeah. The shoulds are starting to combine multiple shoulds from different kind of authorities, profession versus an organizational authority making demands upon your behavior. So one of the things that we see is that for professionals in organizations, the amount of autonomy you have to do your professional practice as you see fit is critical to how well professionals fit within organizations, how comfortable you are, and how effective you perceive yourself to be. So it's in a sense, okay, I'll be there at 8 o'clock. I'll punch the clock. I'll wear the organizational uniform. I'll laugh at the boss's jokes. Ha 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 ha. I'll go to the party. I'll give the United Way. I'll do all the things the organization expects me to do. And I can be relatively happy doing those things so long as I'm paid sufficiently well if I'm also permitted a lot of professional autonomy in the way I engage in my practice. And that's been a solution that a lot of organizations have found. Not all. Okay. Notice that social control in this bureaucratic paradigm is subject to direct supervision, or it's a product of direct supervision. Standardized rules, standardized sanctions. And notice this, as well as the selection of homogeneous personnel, especially at top levels. That is to say, hire the same kind of people. Same kind of people operating from the same paradigm. Now there's a woman by the name of Elizabeth Moss Cantor, who writes a book back in around 1967, 1969 called Men and Women of the Corporation. Very, very important book. Because one of the things she examines is the dynamic of unintended discrimination within organizations. She's writing from the perspective of a woman who's aware that there's a glass ceiling for women in organizations, particularly at that time. But she's also writing with an awareness that in some organizations or in some settings, that so-called glass ceiling, or it might even be glass door, it's not just a question of promotion, it's a question of whether you're even hired, can operate against men when the organization is dominated by women. Or it can operate against blacks when an organization is dominated by whites, or against whites when the organization is dominated by blacks, or whatever. So it's not just gender, it's not just race, it's not just ethnicity, it's not just social class, it's any organization or any part of an organization that becomes dominated by people who are homogenous with regard to a particular variable, and who then, frankly, simply don't trust the judgment of people who are not like them on that particular variable. So it might even be the Ivy League kind of thing, you know? Well, I'm from an Ivy League college, and you're from an Ivy League college, and you're from an Ivy League college, but you're from a state college. We're not so sure, kind of thing. I'm told that Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, used to, and I'll clean this up because it was actually more graphic than this. It was actually a lot more graphic than this. But he absolutely enjoyed calling aides in. And by aides, they would be people with master's degree from Dartmouth and Harvard and Princeton, etc., and reminding them that he was the president and he was from Southwest Texas State Teachers College. You know? Just to kind of get back at the years of snubs that he had experienced. Well, social relations in bureaucracies, according to Weber, in theory, are based on impersonal criteria. The relations are role-based, segmental and instrumental. Basically, that means that people relate to one another as incumbents of office with a very definite and circumscribed relationships with one another. Very definite and job-related interests in one another. Notice what's happening here. In some sense, Weber is stripping the humanity out of the people who populate organizations. He's saying that in theory, in this ideal type, not really in the real world, but in the ideal type, rationality demands that we relate to one another with respect to our respective roles within the organization, that we stay true to that, and that we don't get involved in anything else. That would be very rational, wouldn't it? Seems pretty alien from a social work perspective, doesn't it? Right? But again, he's not necessarily saying this is the way things are. Recruitment, hiring for that matter, advancement based on specialized training, formal certification. Notice how that really applies in so many human service organizations. Okay? Employment constitutes a career with advancement based on seniority or achievement. Employment as a career, particularly employment in the same organization, working your way up the ladder of the organization. Notice that the incentives are remunerative primarily. What does that mean? What's a remunerative incentive in this case? Money, monetary. Yeah, that's right. Salary and benefits kind of thing. That's the primary incentive here. I'm sure that's also why you all came into social work. It's the big bucks, right? You came to get the big bucks. So again, I mention that because think how alien this notion that the primary incentives as monetary or remunerative are to folks in our profession and similar professions. Think of the distance, the disparity between this particular claim, oh, by the way, and many systems that are built on this particular claim, and the way we actually think, feel, and what really motivates us. Social stratification of bureaucracy, right? It's differential. There's strong differentiation in the ranks. There's strong differentiation in the distribution of prestige, privilege, power, and for the most part, other tangible rewards. The claim basically is that people who occupy the elite positions of the organization are more important to it, are less easily replaced, that the decisions that they make, the impact they make on the organization are more important to the organization. And therefore, both in order to recruit, in order to retain, and in order to reward, the nature and the amount of the reward must be greater for people who are in the elite. Go ahead.
Can you define again isomorphic? I can't remember.
Isomorphic. In this case, it means that if you're looking at power, the distribution of power, and you look at the distribution of salaries, you're going to see the two distributions to be very, very similar to one another. They're going to have very, very similar structures. Right. Also, in terms of flexibility, autonomy within a job, very, very similar as well. Now, one of the things that we're going to see is that technology, the knowledge or the operations that change raw material into a finished product, or at least that move a product along, can have a strong bearing upon the amount of power that people in organizations actually have. Because the insight here is that the more you command a difficult technology, and the more central that technology is to the most important goals of the organization, you will gain power. Hear that? It's actually two different things operating together. The more technology is difficult to master, right? The better you can do it, the more you're likely to gain power. Just through that dynamic alone, all other things remaining equal. The more you control a technology that lies at the very heart of goal achievement for an organization, the more you're likely to gain power as well. Put those two things together, and you have a powerful, powerful set of factors that are elevating people into power in organizations. Think of physicians in hospitals. Think of the brain surgeon in a hospital. All right? You're talking about a very advanced, very complicated technology. And, oh yeah, surgery is really very important to the central goals of hospitals. Right? Surgeons are going to have a lot of power in hospitals. I don't care where you put them in the organizational hierarchy. You could put them way down here if somehow you could achieve that. And frankly, it's even possible to do that, drafting physicians into the military, for example. You can get them. But the fact is that the power, the knowledge that they command, so central to the goal of that organization, will elevate them in power, formally or informally. Right? Now, one might think, gee, well, a social worker in a human service organization, we gotta just have it made, you know? Until you begin to go back to that concept of goal, until you begin to look at how human service organizations actually adapt to their environment and what it is necessary for them to do in order to survive. And then maybe high quality services on behalf of particularly disenfranchised client groups that aren't particularly well respected in our community. Maybe doing well by these people doesn't really elevate the effective practitioner all that much, because in the end, that may not be all that central to the organizational goals and organizational survival. Notice the differentiation in bureaucracies is maximized in terms of specialized tasks, division of labor. Really, really mastering a particular craft, really mastering the production of a particular product, and then dividing the task up to achieve that specialization, providing coordination across those various parts. Small agencies won't have that much differentiation. Think of DCS. You know, think of General Motors. Think of large organizations. You get a better idea of the complexity that's there. Oh, and I just used the word complexity. complexity organizational concept that speaks to the number of different parts in an organization, for the most part, different departments or different divisions or whatever. It can also speak, complexity can also speak to the spatial distribution of those parts. Okay. Questions about bureaucracy, at least just as a kind of a theoretical construct.
What does that mean, spatial distribution?
Let's say that you have two organizations, one organization, okay? Let's say one of them's here in Johnson City, one's in Kingsport, okay? The one in Johnson City has two offices and they're located right next to one another. The one in Kingsport has two offices, but one's located north of town, one's located south of town.
You mean literal spatial?
That's exactly right.
That's what I'm sure.
That's exactly right. On the other hand, let me go with the other example. Here's an organization that has two offices in Johnson City. This one's in Johnson City also. It has 20 offices, which is the one that's more complex. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
My husband works for Walgreens. They're scattered all over the place.
Yeah, my brother-in-law does as well. Yeah. And by the way, half the time he's in China or India or Puerto Rico or Japan or someplace like that. Now he's in Florida, if you can imagine that. Yeah, all over the place. Human service organizations, because that's what we're most about in social work. Defining characteristics of human service organizations. And much of this comes from a fellow by the name of Yeheskel Hassenfeld. Yeheskel Hassenfeld, the University of Michigan, at least at the time I knew what he was writing. And he's really well known, I think, for the work he's done in helping to understand and clarify the nature of human service organizations. Defining characteristics, human service organizations work with and on people. With and on people. Which is to say that humans tend to be our raw products. And humans tend to be our finished material as well, our finished product. Raw material and finished product. Okay. Typically, the goals of human service organizations are vague. Oh, by the way, they're intended to be vague. They're ambiguous. Oh, by the way, they're intended to be ambiguous, and therefore they're problematic. We tend to make very global statements in our official goals in human service organizations. Very, very much of the mom, American flag, apple pie kind of variety. Here, we come back to this notion of a turbulent environment. Human service organizations typically operate in a turbulent environment. And here's I'm using a term that actually came from an author by the name of Sherry Terryberry. Did I mention that name before? Yeah, Sherry Terryberry. And she was examining environments and basically in a variety of ways that environments can be differentiated. They can be dense, so they can be sparse in terms of the resources that they have. They can be stable or they can be changing, etc. An environment which itself, its changes, and changes occur as a result of other changes in the environment. Sometimes beyond the horizon. We don't even see changes that then give rise to changes that are very significant for us. That's a turbulent environment. So changes are significant in magnitude, they're significant in quantity, they're unpredictable by virtue of the fact that many of the sources of change occur outside of our own purview. Very, very typical of human service organizations. You think in terms of child welfare, for example, things kind of going along on normal, and then a child in foster care dies. Yeah, well, the first thing you know what happens is a newspaper gets a hold of that, and now everybody is a child advocate. Now, they weren't yesterday, right? But now they are, you know. And now every third employee in DCS is expected to pay up somehow and be held accountable for that kind of thing. Kind of hard to predict when those things are going to happen, right? Yeah. Right. Now, human service organizations, in contrast to so many non-human service organizations, particularly organizations in the manufacturing sector, human service organizations work with indeterminate technologies. Right? Now, basically what this means is that we don't have, in the human service organizations, typically, almost universally, this nice, precise, well-developed, even mathematical theory, models of causation that we get to work with. Even if you're making cookies, right, for Betty Crocker or whatever. Well, I don't know if Betty Crocker makes cookies. Keebler, all right? Keebler. You're an elf working for Keebler, all right? And you probably have some like conveyor belt here. And if it's a clean conveyor belt, maybe you can put the dough right on it. If not, you put trays on there that have been sanitized. And you're putting the little things of dough on there, and the dough have already been processed in such a way that it has so much flour and has so much moisture added to it. It has so much egg or whatever it is that you're using to stick this stuff together, you know, that it's been pressed to a certain level. You know, it's got a certain consistency, and then this thing goes rolling right through where it's fired or baked or whatever you do with a cookie, right? Very nice and precise. Very nice and precise. I'll come back to a child welfare agency, right? I'm sure that tomorrow the family that walks into your office because they're required to be there and don't want to be there, right, are exactly like, the members of that family are exactly like the people you saw yesterday. Because after all, that's how DCS or how human services work, right? That the clients are nice and precise. They've already been massaged in such a way that all the ingredients conform to a particular formula. And oh, by the way, not only that, we know exactly what to do with them and to do on them. Our knowledge of humans and of the human change process is that complete and is that accurate. And we're all trained, we're all honed to that level of precision in our practice, that we can take this nice, fine, determined raw material and run it through a technology that promises us 99.3% level of success. Have I described a human service organization accurately? I haven't even come close, have I? I mean, I haven't even come close to that. You know, so much of the time a person comes into our office, you know, we don't even know how we're going to be able to establish a relationship with them, or how long it's going to take us to establish a relationship with them, right? Or really what their real problem is as they see it. No matter what they said to the aide or the assistant who did the in-processing work, when they finally come down and talk with us, we're likely to hear something that's substantively different, you know? Whatever they gave the aide, that was just a ticket in the door, right? And now what are we going to do with them today? That's more the reality of human service organization. Right? And so then what do? Well, we fall back on our textbooks that we've read. Right? We fall back on our notes. We fall back on the conversations we had with our supervisors. We fall back on our own experience as a human being and as a practitioner. And we try and knit that stuff together with some kind of logic and some kind of theme that seems and feels right to us. And then we rely upon our confidence and our professional judgment that the sense that we have that is right is authentic, and we go with that for a while, right? Does that sound like a determinate technology? It doesn't. You know, may not be bad, because after all, we aren't working with widgets. We're not working with clay or with flour and eggs. We're working with human beings, and every human being is unique. The indeterminate technologies of human service organizations can be thought of as emphasizing one of these three different fundamental goals: people processing, people sustaining, or people changing. Now, a people processing technology is essentially a technology that simply changes an individual's status without changing the person, him or herself. Right? So, a people processing technology might be an employment bureau, where you're taking people who are asking for help in finding work, you're seeing whether they're qualified for the services that you have to offer, you're helping to assess what their knowledge and skills and preferences and predilections are, you're trying to broker and match those kind of things with needs from people who want jobs, and then you're sending them on their way, perhaps with some hope. But the fact is that hope is something a bit intangible and something lower down on the priority list of things you're hoping to achieve. What you're hoping to achieve is that these people are simply employed. Okay? They go from unemployed to employed thanks to you. That's people processing. Okay? People sustaining. You're trying to hold body and soul together as best you can. A lot of the work in nursing homes, particularly with people that say are suffering from Alzheimer, we have a pretty good idea of how that's going to eventuate. And what we're trying to do is to help these people retain as much of their personal power, dignity, sense of worth, and happiness as possible for as long as we can. We're trying to sustain them in that. Frankly, I think a lot of the anti-poverty programs, including AFDC in the old days, a little bit less so now, but still some elements of TANF, right, are really designed to sustain people in poverty as opposed to help to get them out. Again, I think TANF intends to do a better job than that than AFDC did, but that's people sustaining. Right? People changing now, those are the technologies where what we want as a finished product after we've intervened is a changed individual. It's an individual who has new sets of skills, new ways of thinking, acting, processing emotions, or whatever. So when we're talking about complex adaptive systems, this is really the first time we're talking about engaging the ability of human beings to change the way they behave, the way they think, the way they process emotions, etc., here in people changing. Now, for a second, think about the work you're doing in an agency, whether it's your internship, whether it's your employment, or whatever. Right? Chances are you can identify certain things that you're doing as emphasizing people processing, people sustaining, or people changing. Right? And Christina's standing right back, or sitting right back there, and I know what you're doing in terms of your work. Would you feel comfortable sharing how this kind of plays out in the work that you do?
Just in the services or overall as the organizational operation?
However you want to answer it.
When you look at people processing, as far as hospice services, it may be in, sometimes people processing and people sustaining kind of overlap. I can see that to a degree in what I'm doing, because within people processing, you are giving them things, skills, and abilities in order for them to sustain their quality of life at that point in time. So I can see those two possibly interlapping. People changing, the finished product, new skill set. You would be giving, as far as the clients, a new skill set, and that would be education and abilities in order to cope and sustain, as well as process. So, are they all intertwined and intermingled?
Certainly can be. Certainly can be. Yeah. Let me give you an example, and it's an example where a lot of people experience a lot of ire. Inner city schools. Inner city schools. Now, what's a school supposed to do? If you're supposed to be a changing environment for the child, isn't it? Right? Supposed to be, right? What's been the accusation for many inner city schools, and for that matter, very many rural schools, particularly in impoverished areas? Yeah, processing or simply sustaining, right? I mean, the school is daycare center. The school is simply a place for kids to have to be for a period of time, right? So you know they're not getting into trouble, and the parents can go off and do what they want to do. Well, the fact is that wasn't what they were set up to do. So sometimes the problem isn't that we were set up to people process and we failed to achieve that, or that we were set up to change people and we didn't achieve that. But sometimes the problem is that we've slipped in terms of what our goals were or what our technologies were, how we operate, so that we achieve one without achieving the other. The important thing is just to be aware that there are these broad kind of themes in the technologies of human service organizations, and we can differentiate between different intervention schemes, different departments, or different organizations many times on the basis of differentiating across the kinds of technologies that are used. Oh yeah, and sure, in human service organizations, some technologies are more precise and determinate than others. A hospital is still a human service organization. It's working on and with people, right? And so if you have an appendectomy that takes place in a hospital, that's a far more determinate kind of process, typically, than psychotherapy out of the mental health unit in that same hospital. Technologies change. Or technologies vary in terms of their precision. Oh, and by the way, there are other technologies away from the core technologies of such organizations that also exist. Try and get out of the hospital without paying your bill, right? There's a whole technology of billing that's involved there as well. Pretty sophisticated one. All right.
Would you say that the people processing, sustaining, and changing, sometimes even if the organization itself is set up to do whatever it is it's supposed to be doing, that it also depends on the clients, the individuals themselves? Some clients,
Oh, yeah.
for example, your school situation, some kids may have come from good homes, eat a good breakfast, and be more ready to learn, and other kids struggle and they end up being processed through the system as opposed to change.
Yes, and let me draw this again, kind of develop that, looking at medicine again and looking at social work. Okay, in medicine, let's differentiate between the surgeon and, let's say, the family practitioner, right? In some respects, the surgeon has the easiest route of all, right? Knock out the patient, engage in the surgical technique. The client just has to lie there, and if you're unconscious, that's not hard to do, right? And you got other people there to monitor that. Now afterwards, there's compliance issue, and compliance is huge in the medical literature and medical field, right? But for the intervention itself to work, virtually nothing is required of the patient except being there, right? Now, if you're a family practitioner, right, oh my goodness gracious, right? Whether you're there in the family seeing them or whether they're coming to your office or not, you're having to deal with whether the woman wants to be weighed or not. I'm speaking about my mom right now, right? Whether or not they like that particular medicine, what kind of side effects they had, what their cousin told them about it. Do they really want to change what it is that they're talking about, you know? So you write out some prescriptions as a physician, you talk to them a while, you try to encourage them, and off they go, right? If they get frustrated at the drugstore, maybe they don't even get their prescription at all, or maybe there's a kind of a problem with regard to the constancy with which they take their prescription. There's all kinds of compliance issues here, right? Now let's go to social work, right? Particularly we're talking about a voluntary client and an involuntary client. With a voluntary client, at least the person saying, hey, I'd like to work with you, or I welcome you into my life about those kind of things. And maybe if we're going to talk compliance, we could be doing that. Or if we're talking about creating an effective union, a bridge between two people working on mutually defined problem, are helping to facilitate a person in growth, but all kinds of things happening with that person in their environment. Heavens knows for many people the last thing on earth they want to do, well, the second last thing on earth they want to do is go see a social worker. You know, the last thing they want to do on earth is not see the social worker. The second to last thing on earth is to go see the social worker, and then, by the way, their whole life preceding this has been exercising the other options that are preferred, which also involve not seeing a social worker. So that's where they've gotten here, right? Well, compliance, cooperation, however you want to say it, empowerment, that's still an open question here. How about the involuntary client, the person who doesn't want to see us, the person who rejects our notion, societal notion, that they're experiencing a problem? Right? Yeah, yeah. And do social workers change people? Do we really change people in social work? You know, no, we don't do that. We try to facilitate that process. You know, the old notion: how many social workers does it take to change a light bulb? Light bulb. That's right. Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah, yeah. So you're exactly right. That is the willingness, the dedication, the resources. Social work literature 60 years ago talked about it in terms of the motivation, capacity, and opportunity of the client system to actually engage and change, to be there with us, is critical. in terms of actually all of these things. All of these things. But it tends to be easier here, right? Because we can do a lot of the status changing ourselves. We can even do it in spite of the resistance of others, right? We can take somebody who's a convicted, accused individual and put them in jail, right? We've processed them. They haven't changed. They haven't wanted our change. Tough. It was easy for us to do that. People sustaining, that takes a little bit more effort, but people changing probably the most, because that's the one from our perspective that involves most of the client engaging in the work, himself, herself. Okay. And as we're talking about these things, it leads so well into this other notion. In human service organizations, the core activities consist of relationships between staff and clients. If you're working for Johnson City Honda, is it Johnson City Honda? Johnson City, Texas. Love it. Okay. If you're working for Johnson City Honda, you know, it's good. It's good to have good relationships with your customers, right? But the core of that activity is going to be the sale. It's going to be the transaction, the financial transaction that occurs there, the ability to generate profit. That's the way that industry works. Right? And the quality of the automobile has very, very little to do with the nature of the relationship between the salesperson and the customer. In a human service organization, the nature of the relationship between the practitioner and the client has everything to do with the quality of the product, if you will. And it's that quality of the product, it's the nature of particularly the people changing that takes place there, that so much involves the willingness and the skills and the resources that the client brings. That's key to the effectiveness of the human service organization. Even pretending that the goals of the organization are what we would hope them to be, and that is to help people change or to help people sustain or help people process in ways that are consistent with their own goals. Oh, and human service organizations typically lack reliable and valid measures of effectiveness. Now, by the way, if your goals are vague, it's kind of hard to tell when you've achieved your goals. If your technologies are indeterminate and not well understood, it's many times difficult to trace any change back to those very technologies of change, which your organization is set up to deliver. And then auspices, ways of differentiating across classes of human service organizations, because they operate in some different environments. Public organizations are governmentally sponsored. They're likely here in Tennessee to be either state or federal. In some states, you'll have county, maybe even municipal human service organizations. That's true in Tennessee as well, but in terms of where social workers are likely to be working, the public ones are more likely to be, well, county, state, or federal. I think probably less municipal. You have the private not-for-profit sector. Now, by private, that means simply non-governmental. These are organizations that have 501c3 status, perhaps. They have a board of directors. It's the board of directors that have the legal responsibility and the legal authority for the operation of the agency. The voluntary sector is by definition not for profit. Any money that exceeds cost is plowed back into the organization and its operation rather than taken out as profit in the purses of shareholders. Where does that happen? Well, that happens in what's defined as the proprietary sector or in proprietary agencies and organizations. These are for-profit or profit-intended, in this case, human service organizations. University of Phoenix, an example of a proprietary human service organization. It sells educational services for the purposes of achieving a profit, which is then distributed to the people who own or have shares in Phoenix. I'm assuming that Phoenix is a publicly traded organization. I don't really know.
That's what's happening in the agency that I'm employed with, that trend.
In the agency itself or in the sector?
In the sector, well, the hospice service is going for the private for-profit. And you're
Private for-profit?
Private for-profit because the profit that they exude does not go back into the agency. It goes into the shareholders or the stakeholders who have contributed for the prosperity of the organization.
Were you alluding to this in week 1?
The smidge.
Just a smidge, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, wow. I can see how that would be a seismic shift in the way so many of these agencies have run and the way so many communities have looked at that. And it's interesting because what they may have been doing is looking at the funeral industry in general as a kind of a model for this. Because in general, in the United States, at least in the Western world, the funeral industry operates on a for-profit basis. So why not hospice?
And also the lack of government funding through bureaucracies, just that lack of funding, and this seems to be a more, provide more monetary stability, cooperation.
What do we know about systems in terms of their fundamental goal? Survival, right? What do we know about any social system, any system created by humans? Complex adaptive or no? In theory, complex adaptive. They may resist it in some cases, right? But inherently they have the capacity to do that. So as the environment shifts, the economic environment, the level of public or federal support for these kind of things, so perhaps one of the things that you're seeing, and maybe you didn't expect to see it, but then we have that concept of multifinality. Things don't just inevitably play out.
Causality and that multifinality is, and CAS is wrote on my light switch going outside of my door now. So I can explain to people what it means and why, so maybe it will bring some meaning to them because it's very turbulent.
Oh.
So yeah.
Well, you're certainly applying the concepts of class, aren't you?
Yeah, even if I can't pass the quiz.
Yeah, that's entropy.
Yeah.
All right. Tell you what I want you to do here. We're gonna end early today because I'm aware at the end of class last week I kept you about 15 minutes early. I'm going to let you out about half an hour early. Or I kept you 15 minutes late last week. I'm going to let you out half an hour early this time. But before I do so, what I want you to do, and I think there are 16 folks in the class, I want you to break up into groups of 4. Will you do that for me, please? Right now. Just go ahead and break up into groups of 4. Yeah. Yeah. You're thinking about going in the Air Force recruit. These folk here need somebody. Can they have you? Okay, cool. Okay. Now what I want you to do in each of your groups, if you would, go ahead and write down each of your names. Write down each of your names. And you're going to give this to me. Okay.
All their names on one sheet.
All your names on one sheet because you're going to give it to me. All right, now here are your choices. And these are the major categories of theoretical systems that are in this chapter, chapter 3 in your book. One was scientific management, if you recall. One was the bureaucratic theory or school of thought. One was human relations. One was participative management. There were others. I'm just going to keep it with 4 right now. All right. I want one group assigned to each one of those. Obviously, I don't care which group is assigned to which one, but I want this. Is there anyone who has a particular interest? You like participative management? Okay. Scientific management? Okay, scientific management. All right. Bureaucratic? Bureaucratic. All right. Human relations? Way to go! It worked out so well. All right. So now what I'd like you to do is write that as a title over your names, okay? And you're going to give this to me. What I'm going to do tomorrow is on the, ready for this? We're talking theory. This is all theory now. In theory, what I'm going to do is create on the discussion board, right, 4 different groups or opportunities for each one of your groups to offer an analysis of the case scenario that's there in your textbook. Right, so you've got a little case there, as you recall. I want you to stay as true as you can and as exclusive to the particular school of thought that you're now responsible for in analyzing that particular case. That is, in identifying the critical variables. What's your understanding of that particular case solely from the perspective of the particular theoretical system for which you're now responsible? And then I want you to author just a paragraph or 2 about that on the discussion board. All right?
Does this have to be tomorrow?
No. I'm going to set it up for you tomorrow.
Okay.
But it has to be before class next week. You've got a whole week, in effect, to do this. All right? I would hope that you would do it somehow together by pooling your thoughts, making one person responsible for authoring what's, in effect, a collective kind of exercise here. Right? Once you've done that, I'd like you to examine the others, what the others have written, and then just also, as individuals, post your comments, post your reflections upon that, right? When you come back next week, I'm going to ask you, as individuals, if you have a particular affinity for one of these schools of thought. That's real important. It's important to know where you're coming from as an individual and as a social work practitioner as you're entering into this kind of study. What kind of biases do you have? What kind of preferences do you have? What kind of theoretical systems are you using to understand organizations and the behavior of organizations? The more informed you are about who you are, the better able you'll be to see perhaps the assets that other systems, ways of thinking have to offer to you. That's what this exercise is designed to encourage. So you've got two tasks. One is to go ahead as a group, post a single explanation, no more than 2 paragraphs. You can do it farther if you want, but I'm not looking for anything more than that. Drawn exclusively from the theoretical perspective that you're responsible for this one thing, this one scenario. And then, having read all 4, go ahead and offer any kind of reflection or comment that you care to. Questions? Enough for tonight? Enough for me. See you.